I'm going to go ahead and get started. We've got a few announcements before we get to our guest. A couple things. Today is a really special day. It's a really special day for two reasons that this year happen to coexist on the same day, which is super exciting. Today is Mickey Eisenberg's birthday. So for those of you who know Dr. Eisenberg, a big happy birthday from all of us at the Resuscitation Academy to Mickey, who's enjoying his retirement, and we love spending time with him still when we can, and we miss him dearly on a daily basis, and wish him nothing but the best on his birthday. It is also what a coincidence, World Restart a Heart Day. So talk about something that Mickey would totally be 100% on board with sharing his birthday. World Restart a Heart Day is just a tremendous day. Then I want to put a little bit of a plug in for the Cardiac Arrest Survivor Summit. Many of you probably already know about this coming up in early December. December 3rd through the 6th in Phoenix, Arizona. Very close by to you, Dr. Kern. Hopefully we'll run into each other because I'll be there for sure. It's really going to be a great session. There's 200 speakers, including Tom Ray, including myself, and a bunch of other very notable folks in the cardiac arrest field. Early registration, they just extended it for another week, so you can still get a good deal on registration if you haven't signed up yet. And there's really going to be a big focus on rollout and sort of discussion around the 2025 guidelines. So those will officially be unveiled next week on the 22nd, but a bigger discussion will be had kind of throughout the conference, both formally and informally, I'm sure. And don't miss that. So we'll send out a link to the registration to that in the post webinar email as well for those of you who are interested. So now we turn to Dr. Kern. Dr. Kern, we are so excited to have you today. We have been working on this, trying to put it together for almost a year now, and I am so excited that the day has finally come. Dr. Kern is a world-renowned researcher and cardiologist, has spent the majority of his career at the University of Arizona and retired a few years ago. Not to the fields or to nearly as much fly fishing as he would like, I think, but to grandchildren and to other exploits, and really has enjoyed himself in retirement. But Karl was really foundational, along with a couple other folks that I'm sure he will mention in some of the changes in CPR that went on over the last couple decades. And Karl's going to tell us a little bit of that story today, which I am just excited to hear. So as I was telling Karl earlier, I've heard Tom Ray's version, I've heard Michael Sayre's version, and I can't wait to hear the truth on what actually happened. So take it away, Dr. Kern. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, Andy, thank you. It's just an absolute pleasure. For those who haven't been to the distant Southwest, I wanted to at least leave this slide up for one more second to show you. These are our native trees. These are saguaro cactus, and that's about as close to a green tree as we get down here until you get up in the mountains, obviously. Well, I'm going to tell you my story, but as a group, because it's really certainly not something I did by myself or alone, but what was really accomplished through a real group effort at the University of Arizona. I came in 1980 as an intern, and I distinctly remember I came out, I drove out a Volkswagen pulling the smallest trailer that's made with everything we had. We had two kids. My wife flew out because we figured if we all had to go in that Volkswagen, we'd have a tough time still being married. But she arrived in Phoenix where we had a cousin that we were staying with, I don't know, about midnight, to be honest, from the East Coast, from Philadelphia, and it was still over 100 degrees. It was back in the days when you didn't have jetways. You walked out on the tarmac, and you could even go out to the plane. So I was out there to help get the two kids, and she looked at me in this 100-degree temperature at midnight and said, "You have to be kidding me." And I promised her then that don't worry, I'll do 3 years. We'll go wherever you want as a general intern as well. We're still here. It took her about a decade to forgive me, but we're actually quite happy in Tucson in the Southwest. I spent my entire medical career here after medical school in Philadelphia. And frankly, the reason being it was just too good to leave. Well, when I arrived, and this is a plug for those who are wondering, can I really do this? Is this a feasible career path? I had zero research experience. So I went to BYU in Provo. I studied hard, but I did no research. I went to Hahnemann in Philadelphia. I studied hard, but I did no research. I had absolutely no experience. But what I found in Tucson, Arizona was an invaluable mentor. And Gordon Avey is still alive. He's not doing that great. He's got some dementia and he's in a care home, but what a wonderful example of an academic cardiologist, clearly stirring my interest and really set a great example of what it meant to be not only an academic researcher and clinician, but a mentor. Gordon knew just when to step back and let me begin to get some credit and take the forefront, which I think is a rare talent, to be honest. But I'll be forever grateful. There's the original group down on the bottom that included not only Gordon and I, but Art Sanders, an emergency medicine physician, still in Tucson. All of these folks are retired. Bob Berg left us after about 20 years, went to University of Penn, and he just retired. Ron Hilwick was our veterinarian who worked with us in our animal lab for decades, passed away about 5 years ago, and then myself. Well, one of the lessons I learned quickly as I got involved in research was the importance of mentors to both inspire, but also, as mentioned, to allow a mentee to develop and progress. I remember distinctly, Gordon sent me when I was a fellow to both Purdue, Hopkins, and Duke. They were all doing some research in CPR at that time in the early 80s, 83 to be exact, 83, 84. And I went and spent a week at each place with Charlie Babbs and at Purdue and Mike Weisfeld and Henry Halper and Nisa Chandra at Johns Hopkins and and then another quick stop at Duke. But I remember very distinctly coming back. I had one idea that we could compare one type of CPR to another, but I lost sleep at night wondering, what am I going to do after that? I don't have any other ideas. But what I learned very quickly, as you try to answer one question, 10 more important questions will pop up. And really, I've come to believe that the key to success is to pick the right one or the subsequent one out of those 10 as you move forward. Well, the way you do that best is you pay attention and listen to everyone's idea. This is a true story. We were working on some CPR stuff. We had a medical student working in the lab. And one morning he simply turned to me and said, "Why are we doing this mouth to mouth breathing?" And of course, we all responded, "Because that's what CPR is." And then we went home ourselves that night and began to wonder and wonder, what really matters early? Is it ventilation? Is it circulation? Are both critical? And we simply decided that using a large animal, a pig model of electrically induced VF to pursue this. And this is the first effort we made. Very simple protocol, 30 seconds of, as Max Weil used to call it, no flow, untreated VF, then 12 minutes of compressions or some form of basic life support. We actually randomized to standard, which at that time was 15 compressions to 2 breaths versus continuous chest compressions or chest compression only. And then what we actually called the Tucson technique, which was do nothing, make the phone call and wait till the professionals arrive. And as you can see, we were able to resuscitate and have reasonable neurologic function 8 out of 8 with either of the basic life support systems. But if you don't do anything until 12 minutes and then shock and perform ACLS, much less successful, down to 2 out of 8. Well, over the next approximate 10 years, we published 6 separate and distinct preclinical projects looking at all of these kind of features. How long can you wait? How much downtime before it's not going to work? How long can you actually do it before you need to ventilate? And even I'll explain this paper right here was what's the worst scenario? What if you don't ventilate and they actually have an occluded airway so that there's no air movement? There's no billows effect with the chest compression. Will it still work then? Well, here's what we varied. As you can see, these are the 6 studies. We obviously varied the number of animals involved. They were all VF. That fifth one, we actually occluded the airway. deliberately. And
Oh,
then we changed the no flow time from 30 seconds all the way up to 5 minutes, the BLS time from 6 minutes to 12 minutes. And then the subsequent defibrillation time reflects that. In every case, we were able to resuscitate with effort. Sometimes it took 4 cycles of ACLS, but we would eventually get a pulse in 80 or 85%, and no difference between the three groups. But what was dramatically different in these 145 accumulated swine studies, or with subjects, if you will, was that survival was dramatically impacted. If we ventilated or didn't ventilate, we could reasonably get them back and have good 24 to 48 hour survival neurologically intact as best you can test pigs. But if you did nothing in that BLS, it made a huge difference. And frankly, they just almost never survived. Well, the next lesson was don't give up. When we actually first started publishing this data and presenting this data in particular, not everybody was happy, to be honest. And a lot of true disciples of Peter Safar were really uptight. And I don't know that we were actually booed off the stage, but it came close. We had the question and answer period was never friendly, and it was pretty accusatory, to be honest. But
wow.
we decided, this doesn't look like a fluke. And to be truthful, others were doing some similar work. Max Harry Weil, in particular, had done some preclinical work. And so we decided to persist. But what we decided to do was start to look at what else might be important as we studied not just the preclinical world, but what actually bystanders want to do, and what's the impact of all that? Can you teach this? Will people actually learn it and do it? So that's really where the adventure kind of continued. In the meantime, we expanded our group, and I think this is a really important slide just to show that you really do need a variety of viewpoints. I'm going to go from left to right on the screen. So that, again, is Ron Hilwick, one of the original members who was a veterinarian, and just absolutely key for us as we did these preclinical trials. The next is Mohammed Gabala, who was a basic scientist interested in very much the molecular mechanisms of resuscitation. Then Art Sanders, myself, and Gordon. Chuck Otto, an anesthesiologist who clearly had a different bend on the importance of ventilation than we did. Bob Burke, pediatric intensivist. And then Melinda Mylander was a nurse at the time and became an anesthesiologist. And then Lonnie Clark, who was really the manager for Terry Valenzuela's efforts here in Tucson with Tucson Fire. And it really was helpful because people were honest and simply said, well, we need to look at this because I'm not fully on board yet. And I think that simply strengthened the University of Arizona effort and what we learned. So where do you go next? Again, pig data is just pig data. It's not humans, and it's a big jump. I think it's a very important step that you shouldn't skip, but it's not the end. And so we began to think, okay, what's next? And the first thing we did was we simply asked 1,000 lay individuals, what would you prefer? And you
Mm,
can't do this kind of survey without some bias. Obviously, it was clearly biased in that we said, what if you were taught that mouth to mouth wasn't important, that indeed compressions and mouth to mouth was no better than compressions only? Which would you prefer to do? And obviously, the vast majority would rather not do the mouth to mouth contact if it's avoidable. It's interesting because this was an era where we just finished the real scare about HIV. And
yeah,
most people would say, oh, I don't want to get HIV. It's important to realize there's never been a reported proven case of transmission by mouth to mouth.
yeah,
Is it theoretically possible? Yeah, perhaps. If you have a cut, they have a cut in their mouth, but it's never happened, at least that we know of. But the aesthetics of it are not so pretty.
yeah,
If you've done actually mouth to mouth in a real situation, which I have on the golf course, it's ugly. We were playing golf. Some old guys in front of us slowed us down all day long. finally they weren't in the way. And we thought, oh, great. We hit up on the green, and then we realized why we didn't see them because they were bent over, somebody
Oh,
on the green. One guy's doing chest compressions, the other's trying to do mouth to mouth, but not very successfully because every time they push on this poor guy's chest, he gorks up a little more lunch. Not being stupid, I offered the guy doing the compressions, hey, you look tired. Can I help? He said, no, why don't you help the man doing the breathing? And I tried, and it's pretty awful, at
yeah.
least when there's vomitus in the way. So, but anyway, this was actually also, this was a mailing list from the Sarver Heart Center. Their vast majority, they're all interested in heart health, but only a couple were actually physicians. These are, in truth, true lay people who pretty convincingly, at least for us, said, yeah, if this has any hope, we'd much prefer that. Joe Ornato has some interesting data, likewise from this era, from actual even BLS instructors who favor this same idea. If it's not necessary, I'd be happy to give it up. Well, the next step, we went across the pond, and I had met Douglas Chamberlain speaking somewhere in South America, and we hit it off, and we decided to do some work together. And he was very willing to kind of take the next step and look at this concept of compression only. What they had there at the time was a TV show like 911, but citizens got involved. They were part of the cast and the background people. They had to actually be trained in CPR to get invited on TV. But the enthusiasm was great. We had 500 people willing to do that, and then we simply randomized them to teach them standard CPR, which was still 15 to 2 at the time, versus compression only. And then we simply filmed them, and we filmed them several times. Immediately after training, 2 months later, 2 months later, and then 2 months after that. And what we noticed was that nobody could do that as a single rescuer, the two breaths, as the guidelines directed, meaning 2 seconds per breath or a 4 second pause. As you can see, the first 3 times it was always 16 seconds or 4 times what we expected. Interesting, the last time was really fun. The others, they came back for training, but at 6 months, we went to their homes and knocked on their doors. If they opened, we threw Resuscitation Annie in just at the doorstep there and said, oh, you remember us? Show us how you would do if that was your loved one. And then we started filming. It was really great and fun. And they did their best, frankly. And
That's
they were
great.
a little better, actually, having been left alone for that 6 months. They got it done in 13 seconds instead of 16. But
Wow.
the lesson was clearly nobody could do it in the 4 seconds we always assumed.
Yeah.
Well, what's the impact of that? Or then I guess there's one more step. Douglas said, well, he was actually from Wales. He'd grown up there before he moved to Hove, just south of London. But he said, maybe it's just the Welsh. Let's test some other people. And we thought, well, who's the most enthusiastic learners for CPR? And it's clearly first-year medical students. If they perform CPR and the patient dies, they assume it's their fault. Well, we tested them. They could do it in 14 seconds, but not 4. And then we said, okay, finally, let's go to the professionals. Let's go to those who do this on a regular basis, if not daily, certainly more than average. That's the EMS providers themselves. And they could do it in 10 seconds. They were a little better than even medical students, but still 2.5 times what we always predicted. Well, what's the impact of that? What happens if you pause as a single rescuer for not 4 seconds, but for 16 seconds? And that's where we actually found, as we looked at our hemodynamics in the preclinical pig lab, what seemed to make a lot of sense. That the ideal CPR, which you can do in a laboratory, is shown at the top, and then you see that's a 4 second pause. So compressions are being delivered 70% of the time, meaning you have some hope for blood flow during that time. But you can see that the actual schematic here is the yellow is actually the coronary perfusion gradient, the difference between the aortic diastolic or the pressure during the relaxation phase of chest compression. And then the bottom of the yellow is the right atrial diastolic. And so that pressure gradient is what drives forward flow, at least down the coronary tree. so to keep the myocardium viable. Well, the bottom panel is realistic CPR, where we deliberately paused in the lab for 16 seconds to deliver those two breaths, as if we were a single rescuer trying to do mouth to mouth. Now there's only 40% of the time with compressions, and you can see there's a dramatic period in there where there's not much of a gradient. There might be a little, but it certainly is compromised. This may be probably our most famous slide. Bob and I have shown this all over the world, to be honest. This is a real life example in the pig lab, but really shows nicely the concept that it takes a while. The first few compressions don't generate much gradient, but by the end, you can have a pretty decent gradient. But if you stop, it goes almost back to zero and you start all over. So that if you add this in, probably less than 30%, maybe even 20% of the time of the artificial cardiac cycle of compressions, relaxation of chest compression, and the pauses of ventilation, only 20% of the time is there any meaningful flow being generated, at least by this model. We measured, for example, in a number, what the pressure was for the first few compressions, what it was by the end of that 15 or 30 compressions, and it increases at least by 50% over time. But all of that is lost when you interrupt it, whether it's for breathing or really, frankly, any other reason.
Hmm.
And the price of interruption is a clear compromise in hemodynamic support. Well, what's the flip side? What if you eliminate rescue breathing? What's the price you have to pay then? Well, it's interesting because it depends on the physiology of your arrest. If you're a youngster and you get a significant respiratory issue to where you're markedly hypoxic, then the first myocardial response is bradycardia, but that can go all the way to bradyasystole, and it's still the most common cause of cardiac arrest in the young. That's a whole different physiology than the adult who has coronary disease, is putting along, doing okay, and then suddenly has an ischemic event, goes into VF. When they collapse, they still have a fair amount of oxygen in their lungs, in their arterial circulation. The key is to move those oxygen molecules around to the areas that need them the most. And clearly that's not your big toe, and it's probably not even your kidney. It's your brain and your heart. That's where we've got to get the viable oxygen and food to maintain viability for those cells, the neurons and the myocytes. Well, with that in mind, we borrowed a concept that was really perpetuated at Johns Hopkins by Nisha Chandra. This is a dog model at the time in 1995 in their lab. And they simply measured O2 sats while they did continuous chest compressions during VFib with no ventilation being done. And you can see it clearly does fall off. But notice that even by 10 minutes, the mean arterial sat is 70%. Is it normal? No, it's not normal. But is it enough to help those myocytes and neurons survive? Yeah, it is. So what we've taken from this is that you cannot push off ventilation forever, but for the first 10, 12 minutes of cardiac arrest, circulation seems to be, at least in our view, way more important than ventilation, as long as, again, the physiology fits, i.e., it's an adult with sudden witnessed collapse where you have a fighting chance. Well, these are our own data. We did a similar thing and found almost identical that after 7 minutes, it was 76%, whereas with Nisha's, after 10 minutes, it was 70%. The other thing that's of interest is the concept of gasping. And gasping is a primitive reflex driven neurologically, which we've all come to recognize is actually quite helpful. And it continues when there's some blood flow, not forever, but for 2, 3, 5 minutes, you can move significant air with gasps if, in fact, there's some blood flow to the brain. But it doesn't start or it peters out very quickly if you're not providing at least some flow to the brain. Well, so that's the price you pay. That's a drop off over time. And again, probably not critical within the first 10 minutes, but certainly can become such. You certainly have to pay the piper sooner or later. But in that first 10 minutes, we think that circulation is more important than ventilation. And what's the price of compromising hemodynamic support? Well, in our preclinical model, this is the first study we published in 2002 with a 15 to 2, showing that there was a dramatic difference. No longer was it just the same when we actually realistically interrupted as a single rescuer, lay rescuer probably does. It was dramatically different, as you can see here. Then the American Heart, partially from this, but other data as well, decided to move from 15 to 2 to a 30 to 2 ratio. So 30 compressions before the two breaths. So we went back and did a very similar experiment 5 years later. Um, and indeed, it was better, but there was still improvement and even significant difference in favor of compression only, or continuous compression, as we called it then. Well, so the lesson learned at that time, to be frank, was sometimes it's important to take a step back and realize that you need to compare the realistic or the practical, what people can actually do, not just the theoretical ideal. I was part of the guidelines committee. I remember very distinctly, oh yeah, 2 seconds is plenty of time. And if we do two breaths, 4 seconds, yeah, I'm totally in agreement. That's what it ought to be. Well, good try, but in truth, that's not what people can do.
Yeah.
Well, this may be the most exciting part of the whole story. So we had done this now for 15 years. And this is a great example. How long does it take to change practice? It takes at least 20, 25 years. If you look at multiple examples, our experience is no different. But about that 2/3 of the way there, it was Tucson Fire who came to us and said, here's the truth. We were mandated 20 years ago to keep track of our survival rates for out of hospital cardiac arrest. We've done so. And we have changed faithfully. Every time the American Heart has their guidelines, every 5 years, as it was then, pretty religiously, we get on board and we change what we're doing. But we have never seen a consistent improvement. And they showed us this data just the last 10 years. And it varies, as you can see, but it certainly doesn't statistically get better over time. For on the left, all rhythms, 6% survival rate to discharge, and on the VF, 10%. And that's pretty miserable at the 2000, 2001 era. And so they literally said to us, we heard you had some other ideas. We'd like to know about them. So we invited the firefighter leadership, the captains, to come to our pig lab. And we actually did some experiments with them and had them do their best with regular, and then we did compression only, and they looked at the hemodynamics, and then we'd shock them and see who survived. It was a fabulous experience for us and for them, to be honest. And then they said, yeah, we want to try this. And this is where Terry Valenzuela was very helpful, obviously. He could have said, no, we're not going to do that. In fact, when the firefighters decided that the leadership wanted to do this, we were also required to go meet with the city fathers. And particularly not only the mayor, but all of his cadre of legal advice. And it was a really wonderful experience, to be truthful. We went downtown and met with them, and the first thing they said was, "You want to do something that's not what the recommended guideline by the American Heart is? Is that correct?" And we said, "Yeah." And then they said, "Well, who wrote the guidelines?" And we all started to giggle because Gordon was there, Art Sanders was there, I was there, Chuck Otto was there. And we said, well, in truth, we did. Oh, and you think this is better? And we said, we really do. Then you have our blessing, go do it. That was all it was. There was no big, we didn't have to prove anything more to them. They just took that on good faith that we had frankly done our homework and that we really believed we could make a difference in the community. I don't know how that would go today, to be honest, 25 years later.
How
But
was that sounds like a really pivotal moment, right? And you
yeah,
framed
it
it as that,
was.
but I think it's that stepping out of the animal lab, right?
Yeah.
And sort of stepping into real world, into human patients,
And,
right?
and and we had the data that, what people preferred, and it was just time to try it.
Yeah,
And bless their hearts, again, with all the risk, and to be honest, at the end, perhaps not enough credit
yeah,
to the Tucson fire, to be frank,
yeah.
but they were willing. And then we had the assignment. I'll never forget it. Summer of 2003, they had a half-day education period every 2 weeks. They have their own facility down by the prisons on Wilmot Avenue. And we would go down, one of the three of us, Gordon, Bob, or myself, and we would meet with 50 firefighters every 2 weeks. And almost immediately, two responses came from those meetings. One, when we started, they'd have their arms crossed, they're laying back in their chairs like, who are you? I do this every day. Why are you trying to come and tell me what to do? And yet we presented the same data I've shown you. And at the end, almost always somebody would raise their hand and say, hey, can we start tomorrow? And they
Wow.
were anxious and very willing. The second thing that was penetrating to me would they would also say, okay, doc, if we do this and we start bringing more people alive to the hospital, what are you going to do different? Because they had seen the standard model. Oh, cardiac arrest, that's a bad illness. Put them over in the corner and let's talk to the family and convince them that there's not much hope. And they weren't willing to do that. And
Wow.
that's where we actually pivoted and started a real interest in post-arrest care. What could we do differently to change that culture? And that might have been as important as anything else, no question. So, so that was a fun summer. We finally got done with all that training. And on November 3rd, we had a press conference with firefighters and Gordon and I. And I love to show this because it's the only time I ever actually got in front of Gordon Avey. He was just the ultimate boss, and as I mentioned, a great mentor. But this was my day, and we got this coverage in the newspaper, and the Tucson fire began to now do compression only on arrival, and we started keeping records. It was shortly thereafter, within a couple of years, that Ben Bobrow, who was in Phoenix, he was actually an ER guy at Mayo Clinic in
Mhm.
Scottsdale, but he was the state EMS director. And he got word and came down to visit. We went through the same thing with Bob, and bless his heart, he said, we need to do this statewide. And so we started. But in truth, that statewide meant the University Medical Center in Tucson and Mayo Clinic Scottsdale and Phoenix. Those two centers were the ones that really were on board because that's where we were and that's where Bob was.
Mhm.
And we began to start. He started training firefighters up in Phoenix. Truthfully, in the suburbs of Phoenix to start, it was Scottsdale, Mesa, and whatever.
Mhm.
um, Tucson, Phoenix Fire was not interested. They're
Mhm.
the big kahuna
Yeah.
in probably in the state, and they felt like, we'll watch this for a while. You guys go ahead, but we're okay. Well, in truth, with the first time we published and put something out in public, we showed that those who participated doubled their survival. Now, this was all before and after, with all the biases and confounders that historical controls have. But you would never convince the Tucson firefighters to go back. They had finally felt like they were making a difference.
Wow.
Um, and then the Phoenix firefighters went to their medical director and said, "Hey, we're looking bad compared to the suburbs. We need to get on board." And bless his heart, he said, "Okay, let's try this." And the exact same thing. They doubled their survival. So well, this is obviously a picture of Ben Bobrow, but
Mhm.
an absolute champion of the idea that, frankly, doesn't go anywhere in the state of Arizona without his input and
Mhm.
his enthusiasm. And that was a very special time for all of us. It was really terrific working together and gathering some data and seeing what this was doing.
Mhm.
Well, this about just a few years later, we got a call from some folks in Japan. We didn't know at the time, but Ken Nagao and his group in Tokyo, who had been keeping really wonderful records for a long time. and big numbers. They literally had hundreds of thousands in their database by then. Um, they were interested in this, and so they looked at their data. And this was important to realize they had done nothing to teach or to promulgate compression-only CPR. But some rescuers, lay people, had gravitated to the concept really on their own. They weren't willing to do the mouth-to-mouth, but they were willing to push. And they simply compared those groups and found that, again, in in the small series that they had compatible data, that chest compression alone was actually better than chest compression and mouth to mouth for shockable rhythms in Tokyo at that time. That made it to Lancet. It was interesting that we didn't ghostwrite it, but Gordon, I think, really helped them get it into an English that was compatible with publication, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah.
Well, we've become great friends, and they have risen to the occasion. Ken and Dr. Nagogi both have been instrumental in Japan in not only compression only, but frankly in eCPR. And they were some of the early pioneers that showed some real potential that obviously Minnesota has picked up on and made even more impressive. They love cowboys.
I was going to say, Karl, where are you in
So
that picture? Is
they
that you in
came
the
to
middle?
Tucson to see us, and we took them to a little place called Trail Dust Town. It's this touristy little place. There's a nice steak restaurant, but they obviously have these old-timer photo booths. And so we had so many that by the time it was, there's Art Sanders and Chuck Otto's over here in the corner, the two, Nanogi and Nagao, and some of their younger physicians. But the time I was getting them all dressed, they had nothing left except this outfit for a preacher. And I thought, oh, that's perfect. So
That's
that has
fantastic.
been our favorite picture, and that might be the second most popular slide from Arizona that's been around the world. We
That's
show that
amazing.
all the time, and I don't think there's ever been a talk on CPR in Japan that they didn't
What-
show that. So, but great people. Well, about this time we went to our Tucson Fire people with Terry and asked them, we're noticing that obviously lay people are interrupting a lot, but we're wondering about you guys. And they, oh, we pay attention to that. We rarely interrupt, and if we do, it's only for a few seconds. Well, we had AEDs right about then, and you can get reasonable recordings that show when compressions are being done and not being done, at least. And so we analyzed that, and to our surprise and maybe even dismay, 60% of the time in active resuscitations by the Tucson Fire, no compressions were being done. And we just said, wow, we got to work on that. And so we came up with, oh, and this is the actual data. Look at the third and fourth line. So these are the longest period without compressions that we found 3 minutes. And the average was 57 seconds, basically a minute. A minute was the average time if they did pause before they got back to pushing on the chest. And so we went back and we said, let's try a different algorithm. And we called this minimally interruptive. So if they arrived on scene and a bystander was doing good CPR, which is really pretty uncommon then, but if they were, then they would skip and just analyze. But most of the time, we asked them if they got there, either no CPR was going or it was poor CPR, do 200 uninterrupted compressions. Then analyze if it's VF, then obviously single shock and 200 uninterrupted compressions without looking at the rhythm or the result. We were convinced from our animal work that what happens is they often the myocyte milieu is so bad from the ischemia that the shock may end VF, but a rhythm doesn't return without some more perfusion help. And the greatest thing that we saw killing pigs was they just didn't get that soon enough after the shock. We were looking at the rhythm, we were doing it to make sure we get the two breaths in now, whatever it was. So this is what we asked, and they did this faithfully. Obviously, then you go through this 3 times, and then you default to ACLS protocols. Um, and we kept records. And this is the article we published in JAMA about that era, using this that simply showed, again, just really the two sites or the two fire departments through the university and through Mayo Clinic in Phoenix. That for all rhythm analysis, it certainly improved it, although the numbers are still terrible. But for witness VF, it was dramatic. 5% up to 18% were surviving to hospital discharge with that approach with minimally interrupted. And then we actually got enough support that it was interesting too. It was never the docs, to be honest, who wanted to join up. It was the hospital administrators. They had seen the culture switch from where they were very negative. Cardiac arrest to them was a long-term ICU bed tied up, and then you got to find them another bed before you can get them out. It was just a nightmare for them. And yet they began to see that, in fact, it didn't have to be that way. And it was really the hospital administration typically who approached and really had interest and wanted to get involved
Mm.
and followed in the suit. Well, with that larger group of 62 fire departments around the state, similar data, 4% to 9 for all rhythms and 12 to 28. Again, with all the faults, biases, and confounders of before and after studies. Well, here's an interesting experience that I think changed the way I view things, to be honest. My youngest was still in elementary school. And the teachers there also had an educational hour every other week or something like that. And they literally called me up and said, we'd like you to come and tell us about this compression only stuff. We had billboards around town, and we were pushing pretty hard. And I said, oh no, you need to know how to do mouth to mouth. This is a grade school, right? Well, in truth, most cardiac arrests at grade schools are adults visiting. It's not the kids. But nonetheless, they simply said, yeah, we know that. We just want to know what's going on in the community. So I came out and I gave them a 10-minute talk. And at the end, three teachers walked up to me, three ladies, and they were teary-eyed. And I thought, oh, geez, I must have said that maybe they hate animal research. I don't know what it was. But I thought I insulted them. And I started to apologize. And they just looked at me and said, oh, you don't get it. We're all married to firefighters.
Wow.
And what you and your group have done has changed our lives. They're better dads, they're better husbands because they now believe what they do makes a difference. None of them in 20 years, 15 years, or whatever it was, service, had ever had a successful save for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. And in 1 year, they all had. And it was moving to me, I'll be honest. This is the kind of feedback we rarely get. And I share that not because we're special or great, but I think this happens often. We just aren't aware of it. We're all aware that the victim's going to be delighted if they survive, the family's going to be delighted, but it goes way beyond that. And this caught me off guard, to be honest. But it's left a very deep impression on me that you never know. You never know. Well, we've seen these jokers enough, so let's move on. But the next is, can you actually teach this effectively where people will learn it and do it? We've been trying for decades to teach CPR in a variety of ways, and we decided to try once again with this simplified form. It was half the fun, to be honest. We did monthly demonstrations. We literally had people come to the hospital auditorium, and we'd get 50 a month. But though Tucson's not a major metropolitan area, we have 1 million.
Mm.
Do the math. It's going to take a lot of years to get enough people at 50 a month. And so we said, well, we got to do more than that. So we put up billboards. We put up placards at the bus stops with hoping to just spur the interest that they'd look into it. It's always easy to find online, University of Arizona, Sarver Heart Center, whatever. This was our most successful, though. Once a year, we would put this little bill stuffer in the electric bill for, I don't know, 500 or 700,000 homes. And I am sure that the vast majority saw it and threw it away immediately. But some read it as they were moving toward the garbage can. And I know of one example personally where a good friend of mine, a 92-year-old with COPD and coronary disease, collapsed at Safeway, and a young man, 22 or 3 years old, had looked at this before he threw it away and did compression only immediately, which makes the difference really. If you wait 5 minutes, it probably makes no difference. But if you immediately start, and 911 has a reasonable response time of 5 or 6 minutes, this guy was awake by the time he got to the hospital. He
Wow.
died of pneumonia within 3 weeks from complications, but his family got to see him. And though he won't appear as a survivor at 1 year, it was a success, to be honest. And so we did this for a number of years, and then we did this. You know, when we go, Arizona's a basketball town. We don't have much else, so we have a decent college basketball team. And these 3-point cards are almost several times a season, they'll place them on the seats. Well, we decided to place them on those seats for them. And we actually put on the back of this card the 3 steps to compression only. Call, check, call, and compress. Again, I'm sure not every fan read them, but I'll bet you half did. You can't hold it up without seeing the back side of it.
You're in your face. Yeah,
And
that's
yeah,
bad.
I mean, I'm in your face. That's
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
It was simple, it was easy, and people learned, at least became exposed. Then we would demonstrate it at halftime. I wouldn't recommend this. This was our UCLA whiteout game, and we lost. I haven't been invited back since, so there's a risk. But this is also personal to me. Not only is Wilma involved, but the man to the behind me, Bob Charles, is a survivor. He was playing
Oh,
tennis
cool.
at the Tucson Racket Club, went down. Everybody thought it was a joke until he didn't get up. And then somebody started compression only
Wow.
before the paramedics arrived. And we took him to the cath lab. He had actually bad 3-vessel disease, but no acute occlusions. So we
Wow.
bypassed him even while he was comatose.
Wow.
I had to beg Jack Copeland to do it, but he did. And he's made a remarkable total recovery. He's a lawyer, still actively working.
That's
So,
amazing.
yeah. And then it's always good to get in with the mascots at your local institution. We did a school program like many, 6th graders, and that helped. We got famous people from Tucson. Steve Kerr was still friends with us. Canning Fry was with the Suns at the time, and they had a special learn compression only CPR. My one and only moment of fame, I got on the Jumbotron, but it was brief, like fame is. One more cute story. This young lady was interested in being a firefighter. So she went to a firefighter camp on the Mount Lemmon, just north of Tucson, where she learned compression only. Then she returned that fall to go to school. I think she was at Rincon High here. And she played in the band, as did this young man in red. Well, obviously, he went down hard one day. No adult had a clue what to do, which is probably our fault in Tucson, but she did. She started compression only. She then ordered an adult to call 911, another to go to get the AED, told him where it was. They did everything she asked, and he survived perfectly intact. In an interview at the mayor's office, because they love to get credit for any good thing in the community, the TV reporter asked her, "What's the best thing about saving your friend?" And she gets this sly little grin and says, "Well, I've got to take trig this year, and he's really good in math." Well, the American Heart embraced this concept as much as you could hope for, I guess. In 2008, it became their recommended form of, in sorts for bystanders, so that clearly they still recommend for professionals if you can, if you're gonna do CPR, you should include the breaths, but they recognize again for the bystander population, this has real advantages. And so they've been pushing this pretty hard for, over 10 years, about 15. This is a demonstration at the annual scientific meeting in New Orleans one year. These are those kiosks that they've really
Mhm.
promulgated. I think there's over 20 now in
Yeah.
different airports around the country. Within 2 or 3 minutes for free, you can practice and learn compression only CPR. They had a nice float a couple Rose Bowls, Rose Parades ago, including the hands only ad. Well, does it matter? Does bystander CPR actually go up in Arizona when it does. It's slow. This curve is not impressive, right? But it is going in a positive direction. And actually, when they do, when more people do, they almost always choose to do compression only. And then we got some data just before Ben left for Houston that showed that actually it's risen to about 65%
Wow.
in at least back in 2013. I don't have
Yeah.
any newer data since then. Well, does an increase in bystanders' willingness to do it and actually do it make a difference in outcome? Again, just our before and after studies, but what we noticed by 2010, if no bystander CPR was done for all rhythm cardiac arrest in Arizona, the 95% died, 5% lived. There's a small percentage. If they'd attempted 30 to 2, 8%, and if they'd attempted compression only, it was 13.
Wow.
Similar data for witness VF, with one exception, at least in this series, there was no difference if they tried 30 to 2 than if they did nothing, but a clear doubling if they did compression only. Again, as I've said repeatedly, with all the biases of before and after looks. Well, these are what others have found, including Tom Ray and the telephone directed. Again, what it's basically found was no difference in survival, but in truth, no study has shown compressions and ventilation to be superior.
Right.
Came close with rock, but still didn't make it. So um, for time, I'm just going to skip through these. It's interesting because, again, they found similar survival rates, certainly not statistically different, but the conclusions in each study, including the Scandinavians, was, no training had been done for compression only. If better public awareness is achieved, this may well increase participation. Here's the one from Tom's. He'll remember it well. It supports
Hmm.
a strategy that emphasizes compression while minimizing rescue breathing for bystander performed CPR. Um, again, Leif Swenson from Scandinavia. And then Myron's editorial with those two dispatcher. And then this is Graham Nichols, obviously EMS now. There's a trend, but doesn't quite meet statistical significance, that it wasn't better, but in truth wasn't really significantly different
Yeah.
for EMS providers. Well, the current status, here's the last ILCOR, which was January of 25. They simply say we recommend chest compressions. Doesn't say you should or shouldn't. American Heart took a similar approach, at least at minimum, give chest compressions. And as you mentioned, Andy, a week from yesterday, we will have the newest ones. And this is the first time for many years I haven't been part of it. So I have no idea what the conclusions will be this year. Well, in summary, as best we have the data, it really kind of ends in 21, as Ben was gone long enough that his influence kind of petered out, and the governor is not actually funding this, unfortunately, anymore. But we have evidence that if the trends had continued with doing what we were doing before, the increase in survival is 7,000 Arizonans
Wow.
since we started really pushing compression only as an alternative.
Wow. What a tremendous impact. I mean,
We
that's
had a nice celebration of
amazing.
years, 2003 to 2023. This is probably the hardest thing to get as an academic researcher. On our main street that goes through the Speedway, through the University of Arizona, they have little flags, little plaques. The athletes get them all the time, but when we got ours, we headed right down there for a picture. It's no longer up, I can tell you that. And I want to end with one other anecdote, if you will. In our efforts, we always said yes. I was asked to give a talk on compression only CPR at our local branch library. I went, there were 10 people. I gave my talk and I came home and I distinctly remember saying to my sweetheart, Martha, my wife, that was a waste of time. I have since repented. About 3 months later, I was coming back from Dallas, having been there for some American Heart CPR business. And I was flying a lot then, so I was in the front of the airplane. A couple walks on and they stop suddenly. I'm on the aisle and they stop. Dr. Kern, thank you for saving my life. She walks on and then he says to me, we'll never forget you. And they go on. And I don't have a clue who these people are, not a clue. Well, obviously, I tracked them down when they went to get their bags. And I said, I got to know the story. And the guy said, well, you came and gave a talk at the Bear Canyon Library. 2 months later, my wife arrested in our home. And I did compression only until the paramedics got there. She went to a different hospital. I didn't have any idea. But it just shows you, I think that's more common than rare. We just don't always know the real impact of our efforts. This guy, Jerry Cortez, was the vice president for the Anthem Foundation and was responsible for helping them grant the American Heart $8 million to further the efforts to train people in chest compression only. We've had a tragedy here. A family lost their 40-year-old son, went jogging, didn't come home, died of sudden death at the side of the road. And so the Gooders have had a real effort to make CPR awareness prominent in Tucson. They have a Gooder Gala. Part of that is typically a tennis tournament and demonstration. This is Murphy Jensen, who was a famous doubles champion with his brother, who's come out several years. He and I taught this demonstration for probably 5 years running when he had a cardiac arrest playing tennis back east. And he was saved, or at least improved his outcome with compression only CPR. This was just this year where both of those were part of that gala.
Wow.
And it continues to be a strong emphasis here in Tucson. Well, I have retired. This is the best thing I got as I walked out the door. Uh, and this is me just
Ooh,
2 weeks ago on the Madison
nice.
River outside of Yellowstone National Park. I have a group of about 12 friends from high school, college, my mission, medical school, CPR researchers who join me, and it's just a fabulous time. Um,
I
I
love
don't
that the patch has migrated from the
Yeah,
white coat to
that's my last
the
slide
blind
because I want to
vest.
get one more credit for the. It was just honestly too good to leave. I actually got offered a job in Seattle, and I thought about it really hard when Leonard was retiring, but no regrets. It's been a great journey. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Kern. I invited a familiar face to the
I
panel
see.
who
Yeah.
you might recognize because I'm sure Tom has some insightful commentary here. And then I want to close by reading one of the comments from the attendees. So Tom, why don't you come off mute
Sure.
and say hi?
Yeah. Well, Carl, as always, this is, I think, the second time I've heard this presentation in one form or the other, and it is motivating to someone who's been doing this for 30 years myself. It is really inspiring, and I appreciate you sharing that story because it really does make a difference in the right direction. If I were to challenge you, I would say I think we're at a point where um, it's not one or the other, really. I mean, I think optimally we want to do what's right for that patient in front of us. And we are struggling mightily to figure out, when and how much ventilation or compression. Do you have a vision of where this might land? And again, you don't have to get into the weeds on this. It might be too much given the late hour.
Well, I don't, but I certainly agree totally. And I've always, some of the biggest challenges we've had and legitimately are, well, how do you know it was compression only? Lots of things are changing. We
Yeah.
deliberately tried to optimize almost every aspect of our effort. And my only honest rebuttal is I don't really care. If survival gets better and it's not this, but it was something else,
Yep.
I'm okay with that. Um, and then the same way, I am convinced, we started by saying don't ventilate. We stopped saying that. We simply said you don't need to ventilate for HEPs for the first period, whatever it might be at your system. Don't forget you're going to have to pay the piper sooner or later. And if that's early, because your system's able, great. But I have to admit, I'm still convinced wholly that lay people cannot do effective mouth to mouth. I just, I think we're kidding ourselves. And so, as we work through all the details of, well, who's doing CPR? Is it the EMS? Is it a trained layperson? Is it an uneducated? They all vary, but it has been a wonderful, wonderful journey. And I took care of probably 20 survivors that I personally had been involved with. And that's the piece I miss most in retirement. Some of them come and fish with me, which is a great thing. But that kind of interaction also drove me for many years to continue.
Carl, I just I can't thank you enough for joining us. I'm struck by everything you said today, the importance of BLS and the really fundamentals of resuscitation, the inclusion of other perspectives that challenge you and make you better, the challenging of assumptions, whether they're in guidelines or they're physician assumptions or they're provider assumptions in the field, just really going after, do we really know what we think we know, and how can we prove that that's actually true? And then the fact that EMS care drove in-hospital improvements, right? Which is not a small thing to notice and thing to appreciate, and something that I think has echoed through many systems throughout the world over time, is that when EMS care can improve and can drive more survivors, whether it's from cardiac arrest or trauma care or other time-sensitive diseases, right, that can really improve the patient's care in the hospital by forcing those improvements, by bringing more alive people for the complex teams at the hospital to care for. And I'm just struck by the immensity of this story, and I just want to thank you so much for sharing it with us. And I'll close by reading one description from a good friend of the Resuscitation Academy, Dave Hiltz, who described you as a master storyteller, weaving insight, emotion, and purpose into every message. Absolutely incredible. So thank you so much for joining us. I personally appreciate it. We all have had a really wonderful hour, and I appreciate you taking the time to share with us. And hopefully our paths will cross again soon, and we'll catch up when they do.
Well, thank you. It's been a privilege. I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you very much. With that, we'll conclude the October webinar. We'll be back in November. We've got an exciting plan for the November webinar. Not quite ready to share it, but you're not going to want to miss it, and should be really fun. More to come over the next couple weeks. Check your email and you'll get an invitation. As always, we record these talks. They're available on the Resuscitation Academy YouTube site. If you're interested in some of our previous talks, many of them are available there, more every week, and we will continue to progress there. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see you all next month.